Welcome to this Modern Church panel conversation. We are taking the theme, Are We Equal Now? I'm Alison Webster, and I'm the General Secretary of Modern Church. And we are having this discussion on the eve of the formal installation of Dame Sarah Mullally as the 106th Archbishop of Canterbury. And I think, as we all know, the first woman to lead the Church of England. So, our conversation is going to explore some of the dynamics around that, both historically and in contemporary church life. And we're building on a special edition of the Modern Church Journal, Modern Believing, which has the title Not Equal Yet. So, see what we did there. We've gone from Not Equal Yet to Are We Equal Now? And two of our three speakers this evening have contributed to that journal. And should you be interested in getting hold of it, and it's a fantastic read, I'm sure all four of us would recommend it, then I recommend that you join Modern Church, and then you will receive that journal, some back issues, and also the quarterly journal from then on. Modern Believing. It's a journal actually that's been going, a liberal progressive theological journal, originally Anglican, but now very much ecumenical and also global. And it's been published almost continuously since 1907. So that's quite a good claim to fame to have that resource as Modern Church in as part of our organisational life. So yes, do join if you're watching this and you're not already a member. So this evening we're going to look at a whole host of issues around the ordination of women, gender parity within the Church of England, or gender disparity within the Church of England. How do the power dynamics work around gender? How do they relate to other issues of identity and power differentials? What's changed since women were first admitted to the priesthood and the episcopate, and perhaps what still needs to change? Again, how does gender inequality intersect with and work with other forms of oppression at work within the institutional Church of England? Issues of unity. Is there hope? Is there any hope that we will have one unified Church of England at any point in the near future? And perhaps a look at, along the way, the relationship of the church to the state, which, as I think we'll see, is very much has been an element in how things have developed around women's ordination and the institutional disunity that has been put in place since the original legislation. So that's our programme for the next hour. We've got three fantastic contributors. We have Judith Maltby, Theo Hobson, and Angela Sheard, and I'll introduce each of them in turn when it's their turn to speak. We're going to have a contribution from each of the panelists. Then the panelists will have the opportunity to respond to something that a fellow panelist has said specifically and in some depth, and then we will move into a time of general discussion and see where that takes us. So our first contributor is going to be Judith Maltby. Partly, I think, because Judith is a historian, and it's always great to have a historical angle on these things. And Judith's contributions to General Synod have been fantastically useful on the historical front. Judith is Emerita Reader in Church History in the University of Oxford, and also Emerita Fellow of Corpus Christi College, where she was chaplain for 30 years. She's now honorary chaplain of the University Church of St Mary the Virgin in Oxford, and has been for her sins a member of the General Synod of the Church of England since 2010, which is quite a stint, Judith. Judith's published widely on the history of Anglicanism, especially on the history of the prayer book, and parish religion in the Long Reformation. More recently, her work has focused on Anglicanism's literary culture, and she's currently engaged in a book-length study of the American Episcopalian poet and disability rights activist Vassar Miller. So welcome, Judith. Over to you to kick off.
Thank you, Alison, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone, and of course, on the eve of a momentous occasion tomorrow. I thought I would talk a bit about why I wrote the piece I wrote for Modern Believing, and it's about the five guiding principles and the way they have been used and developed in our discourses in the Church of England. And I want to start by saying I'm in favor of the five guiding principles, some reluctance, but I'm willing to live with them. I voted for them when they were part of the package in 2014 to allow women to be in the episcopate. And they were crucial because the 1992 measure to ordain women was a highly complicated multi-clause set of legislation. It provided compensation payments. There was even a clause that said no bishop will be forced to ordain a woman, which always seemed a comical image uh, to me, that somehow, someone would pull out a revolver and he'd be forced to ordain a woman. Very, very complicated. It then gets even more complicated by the Act of Synod being bolted onto it a year later, never part of the original measure, which is something people forget. So the five guiding principles allowed us to have a very clean, simple measure which basically said women will be allowed into the episcopate. So the question is, how have the five guiding principles developed and been applied? And I think there's been some really unhealthy mission creep with the five guiding principles that has worked largely to the detriment, I think, of equality and the place of women in the priesthood and the episcopate. And you can start with the consecrations of Libby Lane and Philip North in 2015. Libby Lane, famous photograph, there's a huge rugby scrum of co-ordaining, consecrating bishops there. The next day, Philip North is consecrated by the Bishop of Chichester and just two other traditional Catholic bishops. Sentamu is there, he preaches, but he's not the chief consecrator, which is, of course, the role of the primate of the province. He or she should be the chief consecrator. And Sentamu at the time said he wasn't setting a precedent, but that's exactly what's happened. In all traditional Catholic consecrations since then, the primates have been excluded from those consecrations. And at the time, the head of Forward in Faith said something very interesting, I think. He said, by delegating that ministry to the Bishop of Chichester, Archbishop Sentamu has ensured that there will be no difference between his role on this occasion and that of a future female archbishop. We hope that those who support the ordination of women as bishops will agree with us that any such distinction should be avoided. So in a sense, the whole thing was about future-proofing against what we're on the eve of celebrating tomorrow. Now, the other thing I looked at was the 2020 statement on episcopal consecrations, which came out of the depth of COVID, but was intended to be permanent, in which Archbishop Welby issued a sort of edict saying that henceforth neither primate would be the consecrator of future bishops, and that there would just be three bishops, because that's the canonical number, and we wouldn't have any more of those sort of rugby scrums. And you might think that's sensible for COVID, but it was clearly intended to be a long-term uh, uh, measure. Now, again, this I think was future-proofing against having a female primate. And there were a few consecrations of this type, and then it just seemed to kind of go up in a puff of smoke from a thurible, poof, sort of thing. And And by 2022, Rosemary Mallett, Bishop of Croydon, was consecrated by Justin Welby. Rugby scrum is back. Normal service uh, resumes. And I think this is, again, people have told me not to worry about it now because it's disappeared. But actually, I think it's a very important episode about the mission creep of the five guiding principles because on General Synod, I kept trying to ask questions about where did this come from? Who's responsible? Can we see the theological paper behind it? And I was told I couldn't ask a question about it because the archbishops in their metropolitan capacity are what they do as metropolitans, you cannot question them. There's no accountability of anything. So it's a sort of form of the Father Ted thing, that would be a metropolitan matter. Just can't ask any questions about it. So I think it's very important to keep a beady eye on all these things, particularly as Sarah Mullally really begins to begin her ministry as Archbishop. And the last little mission creep, if I've still got a minute or two, Alison, is about mutual flourishing. And the thing about the five guiding principles is that mutual flourishing is mentioned in point 5 of the five guiding principles, but it has moved. It's moved to the center to become the overriding principle. So after the failure of the appointment of Philip North as Bishop of Sheffield, the archbishops asked Sir Philip Moore to write a paper about that. He did a good paper on that. But when they commissioned that piece of work, they said, we want you particularly to look at the overriding principle of mutual flourishing. So it's gone from being, one amongst equals to becoming what is the only thing about the five guiding principles, which appears to be mutual flourishing, which also appears to be lacking in mutuality quite a lot of the time. I hope I haven't overrun there.
Not at all. Bang on. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. In fact, you may have been a minute short. So thank you, Judith. Really interesting set of issues there, which I'm sure we will come back to in our discussion. So thank you so much. So next up is Theo Hobson, who has a PhD from Cambridge University and has written 7 books and much journalism, including for The Spectator and The Tablet. He usually writes on the Church of England, the history of ideas, and especially the positive affinity of Christianity and political liberalism, which I guess would be of particular interest to modern church viewers and those schooled in the modern church liberal tradition, and also more generally religion in public life. He is co-editor of a recent essay collection called Create for Love Towards, which was Canterbury Press from just last year, so fairly hot off the press. And Theo is currently an ordinand. So welcome, Theo.
Thank you.
Over to
Okay, well, I thought I might just start by talking about how I got interested in the issue and then move on to the article I've recently written. So it was always in the background for me when I was actually a student. The voting happened of 92 and 93, and it wasn't central to my interest in theology at the time. I had other interests, but it was in the background that something a bit strange was going on in the Church of England, something a bit new when the flying bishop stuff came in. I wasn't following it all that closely, to be honest. And I suppose in the years to come, I kept it a little bit distant from my central interests, partly because I'm a man, and it seemed like a women's issue. It seemed like a church politics thing I wasn't very closely involved with. It seemed a bit like identity politics, like a special interest group. I wasn't really involved in any sort of church politics. I was still a postgraduate student. But then gradually, as I started writing about religion and writing about the Church of England, it began to seem more interesting and more strange to me, just what had been going on. And I began to sympathize quite strongly with Watch and that movement questioning the situation, and also with people who questioned the Act of Synod fundamentally. And I suppose my approach was a little bit different in that I was interested in the ecclesiological question, the question of church unity. Like, how had the church agreed to basically dilute episcopacy, to have a separate form of bishops, a group of bishops within the church? This seemed quite a big deal. And of course, on one level, everyone knows it's a big deal, but it seems that Anglican theology has mostly kind of looked away from that or pretended otherwise. And I suppose, being a bit of a contrarian, I wanted to sort of poke at it and say, well, what's going on? Are we sure this is okay? And I did some journalism about it, and I got a little bit involved through writing an article in the Tablet. And I met Martine Oborn of Watch, and I said, what's the agenda of Watch? Is it just about complaining about the day-to-day details of things not being quite fair in how practical matters work out, or is it about trying to question the fundamentals and say, go back to the Act of Synod and the five guiding principles and say we want to change, we're not happy with it? And so I'm interested that Judith said that five guiding principles is sort of okay and fine with her, because I'm not sure that it should be fine with any Anglican theologian, really. I think we need to go back to the basics of saying, why did we ever dilute episcopacy? Why did we ever allow disunity of bishops to occur, and be thinking on that sort of level? And of course, that's incredibly awkward to do once you have allowed this new situation, because you've allowed a subculture to grow up now over 30 years in which there are bishops and networks and parishes and so on who have been told they're fully Anglican and have absolutely equal rights to be Anglican as the rest of us. And so it's therefore an incredibly messy process if you do try and fight that. It would be a bloody fight, obviously. It's bloody enough, just the secondary fight of what's fair and what's not fair in the running of things. But to my mind, we do need to have that fight, and we do need to be ambitious about saying, if we care about the Church of England, we should care about its unity. And so in my article called Why Unity Matters, I just try and trace the origin of the issue, really, looking at the movement before 1992 of what people were thinking about whether a split was likely to happen. And of course, people did half think, yes, this will split the church. And for that reason, it was delayed. That's why it didn't happen 20 years before the ordination of women, because a lot of the leaders just thought this is going to split the church. And in a way, they were right. And of course, the vote did happen, and then fairly immediately, there is this backlash of the sort of guilt of the victors, in a sense, that kicks in, of the leadership saying we need these even stronger things in place for the dissenting minority. And that wasn't really there in 1992. So that came in a pretty unexamined way, in quite a quick way in 1993, and was voted through pretty unanimously by the bishops, just because everyone was exhausted about having a fight. And it seemed like we have to move on. We can't have a fight all over again the next few years. So let's just let this strange situation happen and hope that the conservatives, or traditionalists, let's call them, fade away in a few years' time. And of course, they didn't fade away in a few years' time. They've stayed pretty constant up to now. And instead of going away, the issue is in a sense hardened. The five guiding principles that came in with the ordination of bishops, female bishops, entrenches what happened in 1992 and makes it even harder to challenge in a sense, because it's just more systemized the equal rights of the traditionalists. And I think we do need to raise this big awkward issue, and it's strange for the Church of England to do, because we're so used to being the church that accommodates difference and diversity, and it goes against our nature in a sense to say, well, maybe that can go too far, and maybe we ought to care about the unity of our church just like any other church does, because obviously the Catholics wouldn't allow their bishops to be divided on this and to have a internal group dissenting from the majority. Is that an Anglican thing? We kind of assume that it is because it's happened, but before 1992 it never happened that bishops were structurally divided on an issue, and to my mind it demoralizes the church just to allow that. And so that's the sort of thing I'm arguing, and it's obviously pretty close to what Watch is saying. They now say they want to change the status quo and revisit the five guiding principles, and I think that's a great thing, because otherwise I think that lobby just sounds like it's complaining about reality instead of trying to change reality. So I think that's very positive that there is a new movement in the last couple of years of Watch saying, let's go back to basics, let's be bold about it. And I hope that continues under Sarah Mullally, but in a sense, she's obviously embodies the opposite movement of accommodating difference and being incredibly nice to the people who don't see her as a true bishop and so on. So in a way, it's quite a good thing that she's there holding the centre as a ballast, and it might allow a more radical, a liberal movement to grow up alongside. How's that?
Thank you. Thank you. You've highlighted again lots of interesting issues there, and also in your article that it was really helpful to see to remember the process by which this situation. I mean, I guess for some of you can't afford to forget that process, but for those of us who are not engaged day to day with those sort of structural machinations of the Church of England, it's surprisingly easy to forget how it all came to be, how it currently is. So thanks to both you and Judith for reminding us of that. I should probably also have said, of course, that the special issue of the journal was drawn together by Watch Women in the Church, which of course is what emerged from what was the movement for the ordination of women after these measures were put in place. So I'm sure we'll come back to that whole question of perhaps the going back to first principles or the basics versus how we work with what we currently have, both practically in terms of how the church is run and women's role within all that. Because I know there is a potential tensions between going back to the legislative basics and questioning what we have versus women's ministry just getting on and being resourced as best it can be across dioceses. But that's for our conversation later. So Angela, you are Angela Sheard, our third contributor. Angela is a member of the Modern Church Council, which we're very delighted about, and is Anglican tutor at Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, which is, and she's part of the ministerial formation team there. Angela is a priest, but has quite an interesting journey to ordination, having been first a Roman Catholic and also a medical student and a junior doctor. So yes, interesting in terms of your own formation, Angela. Angela's MA dissertation focused on the identity and belonging of mixed race people within the Church of England. And she's currently working on a book project seeking to explore some of the complexities and nuances in current conversations around human identity in the Church of England, and that's with a particular focus on racial identities, which is obviously another really important strand of our thinking at the current time. She's also exploring the relevance of Hartmut Rosa's theory of social acceleration to conversations around mission in the Church of England, with a particular focus on theologies of church growth. So Angela's written quite a lot for Modern Church on, alongside people like Al Barrett, on questioning what does church growth actually mean, and is the way that it's being pushed by current policy, national policy development, the best, should we say, the best way of taking church growth or working towards it. So Angela, welcome to you, and look forward to what you have to offer to this conversation as, let's say, a younger person in the panoply of perspective. So kind of in this particular historical story, I guess we're having a bit of an intergenerational conversation here, which is fantastic. So thanks, Angela. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alison. And yeah, it's great to be part of this conversation. I think I'm going to be taking it in a slightly different direction to our previous contributors by beginning with living in love and faith, in fact, the name given, as many people listening to this will know, to a process that the Church of England has engaged in since 2017, exploring questions of gender identity, sexuality, and relationships. As part of this process, a book was produced which functions as a guide through the relevant issues. The main body of text in this book comprises 424 pages, within which the word queer is mentioned only 7 times. One of these is as an alternative expression of identity to LGBTQI+, the formulation generally used throughout the text. 2 are found in a paragraph about queer scriptural hermeneutics, in a short section on voices from the margins. This forms part of a brief reflection on power and inclusion as one of many factors that influence how the Church discerns what is true. 3 of the other 4 references to queer are found in a single paragraph, the only one I can find in the report which explicitly addresses queer theology, although I'm prepared to stand corrected on this one. In a few lines, queer theology is presented as a contrasting approach to appeals to natural law as the basis for our theological understanding of sexuality and gender. Indeed, as LLF notes, and I quote, denaturalization is part of the process of destabilizing in order to change binary and hierarchical distinctions between men and women, straight and gay, cisgender and transgender. Queer theory, the field of critical theory out of which queer theology emerged, is a concept confined sadly to the glossary. The almost total absence of reflection on queer theology within such an extended theological reflection on sexuality and gender is, I think, significant for a number of reasons, but I will touch briefly upon 3 of them. Firstly, queer theory has effected a radical shift in Western society's relationship to gender, especially among Generation Z. The 2018 Pew Research Center survey from the US showed that a majority of Americans who were surveyed were aware of people who don't identify as male or female, with the highest awareness among younger generations. Out of the Gen Z respondents, nearly 60% of them believed there should be an option besides man or woman on forms which ask about gender, and 35% personally knew someone who preferred gender-neutral pronouns. These changing attitudes and behaviors affect the ministry and mission of the Church as a whole because they affect the context of our communities. But they are particularly relevant, I would suggest, given the current Church of England strategic priority of doubling the number of children and young people attending church by 2030. If we are to, quote, better serve the breadth and diversity of our nation, as our current vision and strategy puts it, we would do well, I think, to respond to this important aspect of social change. Secondly, the relatively recent emergence of queer theology reminds us of how our theological understanding of gender has already evolved in the Church of England's teaching and practice in terms of the identity and role of women in society and in the Church. As we're reminded in LLF, scientific, social, and political developments over the 19th and 20th centuries changed our understanding of gender roles and helped to reduce the burden of marital oppression faced by many women in previous centuries. So, society's understanding of gender had already changed before its most recent queering, and the Church has already responded to this, at least in part. Today, the Church emphasizes the ideal of marriage as encouraging mutual responsibility and even liberation for both men and women. And within the Church of England, as we've been discussing, since 2014, all orders of ordained ministry have been equally open to all, as the Five Guiding Principles puts it, without reference to gender. These developments, and it's interesting, by the way, that our conversation around marriage and our conversation around women's ordination have been so separate in so much of our discourse. But both of these developments were brought about by the feminist movement, including feminist theology. Queer theology developed partly out of feminist theology and both builds on and transforms the work of previous generations. The Church's task now, then, is to listen and respond to these new and emerging developments. And all this brings me to my third and final point, which is that queer theory and queer theology does more than offer further critique of gender norms, it also challenges normativity in general. It has no inherent connection, in fact, to LGBTQIA+ identities, but instead is often used in the field to describe anything that is outside of the mainstream. Queer theory, therefore, has scope well beyond issues of sexuality and gender and connects these with issues of race, social class, disability, and neurodivergence, among others. However, although they share a common foundation, various queer theologies differ in how they navigate the relationship between the Church and marginalized peoples. Some queer theologies seek primarily the inclusion of LGBTQIA+ people and other marginalized groups within churches, but others seek instead the disruption of churches in terms of their beliefs and practices, as their pre-existing and sometimes foundational insider-outsider dynamics are challenged in new and radical ways. So, in light of all this, I invite us then to ponder the relationship between inclusion and disruption in our conversations around gender in the Church of England, and specifically the ordination of women. Much of the work that led to the ordination of women as priests and bishops came, I believe, out of a desire for the greater inclusion of, and ultimately equality for, women in the Church's life. This work is, of course, essential. It was and it continues to be so, and those of us who are ordained women in the Church today stand unquestionably on the shoulders of those who went before. But I wonder whether equality between women and men, in a church whose foundational institutional injustices remain largely unchanged, is really the ultimate end that we seek. As we advocate for greater inclusion on this issue, can we also find ways to stir up greater disruption in the Church of England's theology and practice, not only in terms of gender, but always in conversation with other issues of justice, dignity, and solidarity? The queer theologian Marcella Altus Reid reminds us that queerness demands a prophetic and denunciatory posture that refuses imperialism of every kind. We are certainly not equal yet in the Church, but the true liberation that we long for may challenge our notions of equality itself and take us to places of great discomfort and uncertainty in which some of our fundamental assumptions about the Church are challenged. These are places where I believe God will be waiting for us.
Thank you so much, Angela. Yeah, well, wow, we've now got a hugely wide open field to kick a conversational ball around, I think. So thank you so much for that. And where shall we start? I think I'll go back to Judith to give her the opportunity to pick on something that you've heard that's either challenged you or that you'd like to reinforce or build on as we continue our conversation. Judith.
Thank you, Angela. I mean, I'm struggling with whether to be a picky historian for a moment, but I will, because that's what I am. But um, Theo, I said I could live with the five guiding principles. I don't think they're like Jesus or anything like that. Okay, so let's just keep it in
Okay.
perspective. The act of synod, what we really have to remember about that was the pressure came from Parliament. The measure had gone to the parliamentary committee, the Ecclesiastical Committee of Parliament. They said we weren't doing enough for the victims that would be created by ordaining women. And in fact, going through that material, the language about victimhood and safeguarding, they talk about safeguarding all the time. And the safeguarding is about protecting men who are opposed to the ordination of women. I mean, that's kind of grotesque now in terms of the current, a much greater awareness that we have now about safeguarding and abuse in the church. So that's where the pressure came. And I certainly was one of those people in Synod who thought the five guiding principles would, in a sense, turn the volume down on the act of Synod. And that's why the contrast between Libby Lane's consecration and Philip North's consecration was, for me, almost the end of the five guiding principles. Because I did not expect Sentamu not to be doing what archbishops are supposed to do, which is be the chief consecrator at that. So
Mm.
I think that's this the nuanced there in the history, and we might want to later pick up on what that says about establishment too. But I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Judith, for that slight corrective, I guess, but also I think it highlights, doesn't it, just the realpolitik of the legislation and the practices that emerged, which, as Theo has said, at what point do you look back on the very imperfect situation we ended up with, and all the way along there will be people. Judith, as you
Yeah, I
said,
can.
of General Synod who've had to just sort
Mm.
of make do with the best that could be achieved. But Theo, you pick it up. You
Yeah,
pick
I
it
can
up.
quickly respond to that. I think yes, it's true that Parliament did step in a rather clumsy way. I think a lot of MPs didn't know very much what they were talking about, but thought it was the right thing to do to call for the church to rethink and to allow greater rights for the dissenters. But Synod could have pushed back again on that, couldn't it, and said, no, we don't want to do such an act. But instead, it was an act of Synod in '93. It wasn't Parliament. It was Synod who um, put through this new legislation about flying bishops and so on. So the bishops were maybe anticipating that Parliament was of that view, but they themselves were creating that new act of synod, weren't they?
Mm,
And they didn't have to do that, and I think that was pretty hasty of a lot of the bishops and theologians at the time. Looking back, it's quite surprising to me that um, serious theologians like, for example, Rowan Williams was becoming a well-known theologian, and he was writing about the unity of the church and bishops in relation to the early church, wasn't he? But when it came to the actual what was happening in real life in the Church of England, he and others kind of looked the other way and didn't want to point out what a strange ecclesiological thing was going on when the church decided to do this thing. And I know Judith herself has written about this, and we basically agree, I think.
mm.
But we had slightly different takes on it as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I think, John Austin Baker, he's in glory in heaven, was the only bishop
Yeah,
who stuck his head above the parapet on it. But I think there's also, and if we have time, I'd like to go back to this. There's something about the relationship between the Parliament and the Church of England about this, because just fast forward a few years, and its pressure for women bishops is coming from parliamentarians.
Yes,
And when the measure failed in 2012, there was it was front page newspapers, MPs standing up saying, "You're the established church, come on." But when that happened, the argument is, "Oh dear, secular interference in the holy things of the church." Whereas to create the Act of Synod, that created that was fine, that sort of parliamentary pressure.
Yeah,
So
I
we're
think
just
it could work both ways,
inconsistent. But
but
I think,
I
Angela's
let me just
patiently put
stop.
her hand
Yeah,
up.
yeah, yeah,
let me just stop this
Yeah, full
conversation.
stop, stop.
We're still on the what's your key response to something you've heard. So, Andrew, I don't know whether you were wanting to respond to that conversation that we've ended up having, or whether you want to come with your key.
I think it is probably a slightly different point, but it relates to Judith's presentation and article. So I was really interested in that kind of idea around the mutual flourishing becoming an overriding principle. And I was kind of reflecting on this. And so this is partly a question as well, but I was thinking, do we actually have a clear definition of what mutual flourishing is and what
Mm,
it means? Because I don't think I actually have an instinctive understanding of what that looks like, particularly given the kind of issues that you were talking about. And I had a bit of I kind of looked into it and, did a Google search, and it looks like it's a term which is familiar within kind of environmentalism, and it implies a sense of kind of reciprocal exchange, I guess, in the term mutual, as well as the term flourishing, which we might think of in terms of growth, in terms of well-being. But I struggle to see how the term actually would look in practice. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it.
yeah. No.
Judith, did you want to come back on that
Yes,
before?
I'm. What you were saying reminded me something from your article, but now I've lost it actually. But so about, well, I think that's one of the issues is that it was never defined, and there is a sort of thing about victimhood in all of this, and that's something Theo, I think, picked up very well as well. So we finally get to ordain women, but now those opposed are assuming victim status. So it's not really very mutual. And and as I said, I mean, the exclusion of male bishops who were consecrated by male bishops from consecrating more male bishops if they're traditional Catholics, to me just doesn't fit with mutual flourishing.
I mean, if anything, the kind
Or,
of the kind of parallel structures, institutional structures, suggest the opposite of mutuality,
yeah.
to me. And so I'd be really interested if there's been any kind of national conversation about what we mean by the term. Yeah, yeah, there you go.
I mean, the other article in one of the other articles in the journal by Sharon Jagger, which uses the phrase symbolic violence, both in
Hmm.
which sort of highlights how and Judith, you've kind of highlighted it with that. I wasn't aware that victim and safeguarding. I mean, how these words come to mean the very opposite of what they actually mean, in this weird world of ecclesiastical politics where
Yeah. Yeah.
the powerful become and we see it in the world, don't we, all the time? We see it when Trump talks about being witch hunted, or
Yes.
it's very extremely powerful men who've always had a sense of entitlement and power, have the threat of some of the power being taken away, and suddenly language is used in the very opposite way to the common sense way that it's normally used
Hmm.
in terms of how power pans out. So yeah, so mutual flourishing, I think, is a good example of that, isn't it? Because it's in a context where there is no mutuality and where only one set of people are intended, or the flourishing of one set of powerful people is considered to be more important than that of a whole load of others. But
And I think
yes.
we're trapped in a sort of, as a church, we're trapped in a sort of cycle of false equivalencies.
Mm.
And I was a member of LLF from its beginning, so I'll never get those years back.
Mm,
But you see the false equivalency argument used again, that somehow giving the freedom to an incumbent to conduct the prayers of love and faith, maybe, gosh, even as a standalone service, is somehow wounding and damaging to someone who's not going to be there, isn't forced to do it, um, and that these are equivalent arguments, and that wanting to see both men and women ordained is the same equivalent position of wanting to just see men ordained. We we've been around the houses about that, and it's manifested itself in a number of issues.
So can we explore for a bit? Because something I took from everybody's contributions, and Angela, you very helpfully made that connection with, in a sense, questioning gender isn't really in the rest of the world. Gender is in a different place now. So the question, I think, is how have it's the process by which these changes have been arrived at, which feel in many ways to be where the church does not actually, it pays the price of not having engaged with the rest of the world, whether that's the academy or politics. It's as if the church does its own thing in its own little bubble, and the experience of the rest of the world is kept at arm's length. So all the developments in body theology and liberation theologies, and which suddenly LLF has to somehow take account of all that, whilst the Church of England has been ignoring it, or
Yeah.
studiously ignoring it for 30 years
Well,
because it's too controversial. So what do we think about that? Just the way in which it's any wonder that we're in the place we're in when that's what happens, and is there another way of doing things?
yeah, I mean, I just think we're having, LLF and the ordination of women kind of conversation are both conversations about gender, but they're completely siloed off from one another, it seems to me. And I think part of the problem is that I think we often do theology in response to a problem. So we kind of go, oh, there's an emerging issue, that we can see on,
Yeah.
and so we'd better do some theology so that we can respond to it. But whereas I think probably theology should be done in a much more kind of foundational way, not in response to problems, but proactively. I think we should kind of do theology in response to social changes that we see in society, in politics, and we should assume that new theology is always needed, whether there's a problem or not, because theology is fundamentally evolving and expansive. Because I mean, if not, the theological project is effectively finished, and we're just trying to problem solve essentially within our institution. And that I don't think is a helpful way to understand our relationship to God and to the world around us. Yeah.
And Theo, in a sense, what you're saying is that the theology of theological basis of ecclesiology around unity has gone the way it's gone because it's been separated from any sort of it's political pragmatism that took
mm,
us to a
mm.
place where theology is kind of useless.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I suppose my main way of looking at it is that we need to do ecclesiology, take it very seriously, and think, what is the church? What's the point of bishops? If you look at the history of that institution, it's always been about a focus of unity, a sign that the church is united. So it makes a nonsense of our traditional ecclesiology is my main kind of approach. But you could also see it in a more secular way, that any organization needs unity. If you look at a political party, imagine them having a vote on whether women should be MPs in the 1950s or something. You wouldn't have a split, would you? It would have to decide one way or the other in order to be a viable political
Mm.
force. It would have to decide, okay, we're having women MPs, and if you don't like it, I'm afraid you have to leave the party. Otherwise, no one would vote for a party that had two positions on women MPs, would it? And so, in a way, the church should think of itself more in a secular way, although I hesitate to say that on one level. But a secular organization would not allow this internal diversity. And of course, a lot of Christians will say, ah, well, that's what's so wonderful about the Church of England. We model diversity. But I think there's limits to that. I think, in a way, we should be more worldly or realistic on one level and say we want to be a feasible organization and ideology. And, the only way we can really revive as a church is to find new energy and sense of coherence. And although it could be messy, I think it could come from revisiting this and saying, actually, the liberal majority must stand up for itself. And I think, in a way, it all comes down to a liberal majority fearing to assert itself. And you can see why, because in Protestant history, if you look back at the Reformation, it was all a bit bloody, wasn't it? When a Protestant majority got rid of the Catholics and so on. And so we've got something in our DNA to be nervous of unity being imposed through a progressive majority. And I think that's really at the heart of why there's been such a mess on this, is that we have that nervousness of being who we are, being the Church of England, really. And to my mind, that shows a lack of self-esteem or lack of will to live, really. And we need to go back to basics and think, do we really want to be a church that's taken seriously?
And Judith, how does it feel to you as someone who's been on General Synod for 15 years in that sense of how the church sees itself? But also, I wanted to ask you specifically what's going to happen, do you think? Are there things that are going to happen when, I mean, Sarah Mullally already is the Archbishop of Canterbury, but that we take the formal installation as if we take that from day one. What sort of tricky institutional conflicts do you think will emerge, and what would that look like?
That's a really good
No.
question. And I think at the moment the noise is mainly from outside of the UK. ACNA has now, not ACNA, what's the other one? But the Global South group have now declared themselves, they are the Anglican Communion and all that sort of
GAFCON.
thing. Yeah, GAFCON, that's it. I can't keep up with all of these things. I think that I think the international scene, in a way, for Sarah is going to be particularly challenging. To me, it's a sort of, you know, that split has happened already. I mean, they didn't like Justin, they didn't like Rowan. And in some ways, a female archbishop is a convenient, final nail in the coffin for the Anglican Communion as we've known it, though, of course, it's not an ancient institution. Domestically, it'll be interesting. I mean, obviously, being Bishop of London was a really good, she could not have had a more immersive education for becoming Archbishop of Canterbury in terms of all the pitfalls and snake pits that are in the Church of England. Um, so she will be taking that wisdom with her into her ministry as Archbishop. I guess I'm particularly I where we I mean LLF is in a sense been buried now, but of course the whole issue of inclusion has not gone away. Um, and also safeguarding. I mean, I hope that she will lead us to finally bite the bullet and have proper independent safeguarding. So, there's a lot in her in tray.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And as Angela was speaking, I was remembering, and you will remember this too, Judith, that way back in the late 80s and early 90s, the theological work that was done around particularly around inclusive liturgies and worship, and all the work the St Hilda community and stuff that Janet Morley and others did. But when I've looked back at that, the thing that struck me recently was how very gender binaried it was. So the inclusion, so I think, Angela, the points you were making are really important about
Mm.
what felt like inclusion in the late 80s, early 90s that led to or was part of the conversations around the ordination of women. It is now very dated in the sense that the world has moved on, and we are that the challenging of the gender binary, but other all sorts of other binaries as well, is very real for most people. And Angela, I'm going to give you each in a moment because we've only got 5 minutes left. A minute just to think about where the signs of hope are. But I just wonder if there's anything else that anybody wanted to say um, with regards to Angela's sort of very 21st century uh, approach to what these two things that you said, which was um,
Yeah.
disruption and inclusion, and the dynamic between those two things across a range of issues. Did you want to come back on that, Angela, or is anybody else want to say anything?
I mean, I was quite intrigued by the kind of comments that Thea was making around this in terms of kind of some of our emotional and psychological reflexes in entering these conversations. And I think that, I think, I can understand why a lot of people in both conversations, are anxious to avoid conflict. And I think that makes what I've termed disruption, i.e., kind of more fundamental challenge to some of our thinking on these issues, much more difficult. But I think that that work is still important, and I think I wonder how we can, so because you were talking about going back to basics, Theo, and I think that is itself actually is quite disruptive in the current climate.
Mm.
Mm.
And so I wonder what would help those kinds of conversations to happen.
Yeah, I think there's obviously different forms of disruption, and I suppose we have to hope that we find, the right form of disruption to try to pursue, because there's probably unhelpful forms of disruption as well. Um, it's difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, I think there has been a culture set in the Church of England of safety first and avoidance and careful dancing around, especially from the leadership and the sort of managerial systems that have come in around this split. And that just entrenches a split, doesn't it? The more kind of nice, careful negotiations you have about it. So we do need to disrupt that. Um, and it's hard to see how it can come from the leadership. So I think those of us who don't have important jobs in the church, need to do the work. Really, maybe it was ever thus of bringing to life the most basic issues and the idea of a church, because in a way the leadership has kind of lost that energy or vision.
I think, Angela, your thing about inclusion and disruption, that's the most powerful takeaway for me from this um, Zoom, and I'm going to think about that a lot more. And one of the things I've also seen on General Synod is the horrific response to Project Spire and attempts to address the Church of England's historic responsibility for chattel slavery. But it's come with a vehemence. I mean, it's a bit like somebody my age can't really believe Trump is president, but but if you lived through the civil rights movement as a child, as I did, you just cannot believe that people are still talking in the way that they are. But the disruption is can be holy and healthy, and that's what we have to concentrate on, I think.
Thank you. I think this what you've highlighted there is just in a way the value of having the those of us from different historical eras having the conversation together, because it's really important, the history of how these things have emerged, but also the history does not determine or should not necessarily determine the future, which takes me to my final question in our last couple of minutes. I'm going to ask each of you to very briefly say, where is your hope? Where does your hope lie for gender justice in the Church of England? Let's go to Theo first.
Um, well, I mean, on one level, I am hopeful just because I know lots of female priests and they're excellent, a lot of them. And so I can see that the church is changing. Things happen quite slowly, I suppose. And, it's not helped by certain systems in place. But despite that, just on a human level, um, these things do have an effect. And changes around gender and sexuality and so on, they always take, a generation longer than liberals think they will. But, that's not always for the bad. There might be reasons why things have to change slowly. And I'm pretty confident when I look at, the majority church and the fact that women's ministry is so central to it, that there's only a good way this is going to go, but it still does need to take a bit of hard work and maybe risking of conflict that people are avoiding in order for that to happen.
Thank you, Theo. Angela.
Yeah, I think I suppose my kind of source of hope is that there are people willing to keep these conversations going, because I think I do believe that is what will bring change, and and indeed disruption is something which I think, you could argue it from a perspective of change or continuity. And I think we've kind of explored that a little bit today. And both are important. And yeah, there are people who are willing to keep kind of exploring and revisiting some of the conversations of the past, and to keep this to keep the discussion moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you. And finally, Judith.
Um, I've been thinking a lot recently about the Reformation from below in church history. There's a historiographical way of thinking about it that, the Reformation from above and the Reformation from below. And I've been just thinking a lot about how change in the church also comes from the grassroots because people just get on with it. And I think over the next bit, I hope to see a lot more reformation from below in our church and that life feeding up, that eventually the leadership will find it slightly less scary to embrace it.
Thank you so much. That's a great place to end, actually, because it does remind us that in a conversation which is when we get preoccupied or we're focusing on what's happened in national legislative broad sweeps of change, over against that or related to that is what's been happening in individual relationships and at parish level across these however many 35, 40 years with the sweep of history we're talking about, which is not it's not really written down or I mean we know it by our own sort of anecdotally and our own experience and but it's a lot has changed. It's a very, very different ecclesiastical world from the one it was in the late 80s. And much has changed for the better. So thank you all so much for your contributions. That was a really enlightening conversation and really great to revisit these key issues at this point in time. And we look forward to tomorrow and the future and seeing what happens. But thank you to each and all of you for your fantastic thoughts.